These are the 48 American states in the continental United States, and the majority of the population of that country lives precisely in the coastal regions. Here in the West, California has nearly 40 million residents, Oregon a little over 4 million, and Washington 8 million. More interesting in the East. Here in Florida has more than 20 million inhabitants, Georgia 10, South Carolina 5 and the other various states, tens of millions of inhabitants, and at the end of the day, the East Coast has 84 million people while the coast West has 50 million. This causes nearly half of the American population to live directly on these coasts. In fact, those numbers are even higher since Texas has nearly 30 million people and Louisiana, Mississippi, and Alabama also have millions of people living on the coast. And we need to know this to understand that the interior of the United States is much emptier than the coast, given that if we add the 17 American states marked on the map, only 4 have more than 5 million inhabitants and more than 3 million. There are states with even less than a million people like North Dakota and South Dakota that, despite being together larger than California, still have 20 times less population. That's because we don't count all the states that have coastlines. Because there is the Pacific Ocean and the Atlantic Ocean to the west. To the east, further south, there is the Gulf of Mexico, and to the north, the region of the American Great Lakes. This makes states like Indiana, Michigan, Illinois, and Wisconsin also have a wide coastline. So at the end of the day, only a small portion of the American population actually lives inland, with the majority living in the coastal regions. This can also be seen in this map that shows the most populated areas of the United States and proves that the population is concentrated mainly in these two regions, and here in the middle there is almost a vacuum, with only 1% of the American population living on this vast piece of land. So why exactly is this huge place in the United States virtually empty compared to the rest of the country? That's what we're going to answer throughout this video. The lack of inhabitants in this region is linked to the history of the United States. In the 17th century, Portugal, Spain already had vast colonies in the Americas. At the beginning of the 17th century, the first French arrived in North America and settled colonies between the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the island. Speaking at the same time that the English also colonized North America, also settling on the island of Number Speakers and the east coast of the present-day United States. Initially the first activity was the fur trade. Both the English and the French practiced there. The settlers and men in search of wealth who came from Europe, entered the interior of North America to practice hunting wild animals and take them to the coast. Therefore, as colonization began on the coast, the first settlements and towns arose there as the English settlement of Jamestown. In 1607 the settlement of Plymouth in 1620, in addition to the French settlements of Quebec in 1608. After this period the trade between the colonies in North America, Europe only increased, and about 1700 when three powers quarreled. By the new lands the English already controlled almost the entire east coast of the present-day United States and a vast territory in northern Canada, the French in the interior of North America, and the Spanish. The vast territory of the East. Around the same time, the slave trade intensified to North America and the British colonies began to buy slaves to increase their production and thus be able to sell to Europe. This was one of the reasons that until today, the population is more concentrated on the coast because Britain's system functioned as a triangle in the Atlantic. Europeans bought slaves in Africa and sold them all over the coast of the Americas. Like the production farms of the British colonies, it was mainly made to the south of the colony and sold to the north when it was exported to European markets. And already in the middle of 1700 great cities developed here, such as Philadelphia, Boston, New York, Charles, Tom, and Newport, which are great examples of huge cities today. But the interior of North America was still very empty, especially with the war with the North American indigenous peoples who fought against the colonizers, and also for the French to be present in this territory. Therefore, there were not yet huge cities in the interior where this current region is located, which concentrates less than 1% of the American population. But let's get back to the story. It was on account of this that in 1754 border disputes for America. From the north they began between the French and the English. Later Spain joined with the French, and the Portuguese also sided with the English. And we can say that from here began, in fact, the British expansion into the interior of North America and the settlement of the present United States. Because the British invaded major French cities such as Montreal and Quebec, in addition to fighting for islands in the Caribbean, and with these intense English victories, the war ended in 1763 Paris between Great Britain, France and Spain, and after this agreement in Paris Britain retained most of the territories it had captured from the French in North America, as well as Spanish Florida, several Caribbean islands, and other territories decades later, at the end of the 18th century. The British colonies became the present-day United States, which gained its independence in 1800. The United States didn't have even a third of the territory it has today, so the population was more concentrated on the coast for much of its history. Which explains the East having become more tried and the interior less proven. To get an idea, let's draw a circle in the middle of the country. Within this circle has almost the same population as this other part on the coast, but still the west coast that is on the other side. It still has more population than the central United States. And how was this possible? This began in the mid-18th century, when the present-day United States was just a region to the east, but there is also Louisiana, which was from France, the territory of Oregon, which was from the British Empire, Spanish Florida, and Spain, which controlled much of the West. And what started the conquest of the West were the various wars that were going on in Europe, Napoleon Bonaparte and France. It was a power with territories in North America and needed money to finance its wars. So the U.S. minister went to France to try to buy territory and managed to get the French to sell the entire Louisiana territory to them for only $15 million at the time, about $300 million today. This was so bizarre that the States United paid at the time 9 cents for every acre of land. Subsequently, 1,818 and 1,819 United States acquired the territory. British to the north and the territories of Florida, the south, which were from Spain. With this was already the territory of the United States, but it was then that in 1821 Mexico got its independence from Spain and now bordered the United States, but the Mexicans did not yet know that the United States would take their territory, because the great American goal was to have full access to the Pacific Ocean. From a land that opened this opportunity was Texas. The United States began renting land there. The Mexicans didn't like it, and it eventually escalated into a war between the two countries. Several battles were fought, and thus arose the independent Republic of Texas, which was practically an ELO of the United States. And with that, Mexico suffered several prices in that region and finally, after years, decided to sell this entire immense area for the same $15 million that Louisiana was sold to the United States. And it was at this time that began an incentive of the country for a migration to the West, since it was very uninhabited and could not have such an unpopulated territory near its greatest enemy at the time, Mexico. In fact, these western territories even had a vast population, but it was an indigenous population in which the United States had a policy of fighting these peoples. So in that century there was the massacre of hundreds of thousands of native North American Indians as they expanded westward. That is why a great incentive was made for European populations to migrate to the United States with the promise of a better life. At the time, Europe was experiencing great conflicts on the continent. For all this, the West was getting more and more populated, but the central region did not stay so much, because in the center of the United States are great plains and vast regions of rivers, where it is totally ideal for planting. Therefore, huge agricultural estates sprang up there and few large cities, since the products of these territories were sold in the East. But that hasn't answered us yet because this flat region has become extremely depopulated. And why has this mountainous region on the west coast become so much more populous? This happened because the United States found something precious there. In the decade of 1840, an immense amount of gold was discovered in California. The news of the discovery was so great that even sailors sailed around Cape Horn and crossed to the Isthmus of Panama to reach that region of California. But within the United States, one of the most used routes was the land route of 3,200 kilometers coming from the east of the country. In August 1848, 4,000 prospectors were in the area in 1 year. About 80,000 arrived at the California gold mines in 1853. Their numbers had already grown to 250,000, and in all this had so much so that more than 300,000 people came to California for this reason. That's why today California has 40 million people and is the most populous state in the country. Which brings us to this overpopulated region in the middle of the United States, in which less than 1% of the population is living here, even though it is 4 times larger than Portugal. Has history shown us why this happened? But there are many factors that can explain this still. Because there are only 3 million people, this is strange since the city of Denver right next door has the same 3 million as well. The cities here are super depopulated, such as Bismarck, Midland, Odessa, San Angelo, and so many others. One of the is the reason for this the amount of territories belonging to the native peoples of North America, such as the Appalachians to the south of the region, in addition to those that they own, the Comanches, the Cayennes, or the ELX. The geography of this region also does not favor much. About half of the United States is very arid and mountainous. So much so that here there is the region of the Rocky Mountains and the Sierra Nevada. In addition, the average altitude of the west is almost triple that of the east. This immense strip of land is also about 60% arid, almost 30% dry, and only a little temperate climate to the south. Moreover, this region also follows the pattern of the coldest regions in North America that tend to be unpopulated, so much so that the most populated regions of Canada are to the south, where the climate is warmer, just as it is in the United States, and this region that encompasses 1% of the American population has a peculiar geographical factor for being in the transition between the mountains. From the west and the lowlands occur effect called rain shadows. The polar winds that come from Canada and the Great Lakes region enter the interior, and when they arrive here, part of this area is barred by the altitude of the western mountains. Therefore, this region has a drier and colder climate. And populating the regions with better agriculture and warmer is something that throughout human history has proven to be better. That's why only 3 million people live on this immense strip of land that represents much of the United States.